Hello, ladies and gents. Today we're going to take a look at dataset creation. Here's the deal. If you take a look at your first stats course, we gave you ready-made datasets. And if there were mistakes that you made along the way and you really messed up your data, not a problem. You just simply went back to Blackboard and you pulled down the original file and you started again. You can't do that when you're working on your own data created from your own questionnaire. So for instance, in Business 307, we are working with real clients and collecting data from the clients, and we could end up with dozens and dozens of columns and hundreds of rows. That's a big data set, which if you created that manually can really cause problems if you lose that original data. You have to go back and input the whole thing again. So we're going to talk about some good practices around data set creation, as well as dealing with errors that may occur and common issues which come up. We will take a look here then at protecting the data, the setup of the data set, and question types. And that will actually be in the first video. And then in the second video, I'm going to talk about cleaning the data and then just really quickly finishing up. So that's what we're going to take a look at. We're going to start here with protecting the data. And so I've got a data set here. I'm going to talk about how you actually set this data up, of course. But the important thing to note here is that even as you're inputting the data, you want to be saving the file many times. And especially if you've got a number of different people who are entering the data. It's not a big problem, of course, if you've got the survey which is using, say, Google Forms or SurveyMonkey. It's important in that case that you don't just simply download the summarized results, but you download a spreadsheet that looks like this so that you can actually do some analysis on it. But let's say you've got paper copies. And so you've got a team of, let's say, 6 people, and you are collecting about 200 surveys. So you're going to do 30 or 35 a piece. And so it's really important then that you all enter the data the correct way and follow certain conventions about how you set up your data, how you code your data, all that kind of stuff. But it's also really important to know that you want to be making multiple copies and saving as you go through this, so that if something goes kablooey and you lose the file, then you have only lost a few minutes here and you can go back and actually pick that up. So a couple of things to note here is to, as I mentioned, make multiple copies, even as you're creating the data. If you take a look at my file name at the very top here, you'll see that it says Unit D, Data Cleaning version 7. And that's because at several points along the way, I was making changes to the file, getting it ready for you. And so I had version 1, version 2, version 3, and so on like this. And I actually did that about every half hour or so, even less, when I'm making any major changes on the data. So that's an important thing to keep in mind here in terms of protecting the data. The second thing here then is to save it not just in multiple copies, but to save it on multiple computers, because of course a computer can get lost or stolen, or a file can be corrupted. Of course, you've got multiple copies, but you're going to send it then to each of the persons in your group. And then the last thing here, which is really important, and this is for your analysis too, but also in the initial stages of setting up your data, is to make copies of the original data sheet. So what I've got down here is I've got the original data. You can see the tab down here. And then what I do is I right click on the tab, and I'm going to choose Move or Copy, make a copy, and then press OK. And what that does is it makes an exact duplication here of this particular original data. And what I do is I never touch the original data. One thing you could do is you can go up here and just go to cell A1 here, and then I'm going to push Control Shift and then End. Or you can just simply click and highlight all of your data. And then I usually make them all red like this. Or you could color the cells, right? You could shade them yellow or something like that. And what that tells me here is that if I hit that tab and I start working on this tab, then it should clue into me that, hey, that's my original data. Don't even touch that. Work only on the copy. So I would go and take this copy that I made, which is now in black here, and that's the one that I would start with cleaning up and so on. And when I get a cleaned version, then I would only make copies of the clean versions and work on that particular copy when I'm analyzing the questions. I've got a copy here. It's called the clean data, and it's actually not clean, but what I did was I set it up briefly here to show you some of the errors that I want to look at, as well as just some of the special kinds of questions that I've got. So this isn't, of course, this isn't an exact copy of the original data right here. It is in terms of numbers, but I've added some shadings here just so that I'm not going through and doing that while we're talking here. So let's go back here, and we just talked about then protecting the data. Now let's talk about the actual setup of the data set. So the data set then in Excel is called a list, and it has certain characteristics that we want to look at here. So I've got a number of things that I want to talk about here, deciding on the numbering and coding as a group, and then really how you set up the columns and the rows, and things like freezing rows and a uniquely shaded row, and then setting off the data from anything else. So let's talk about each one of those there. So the first thing I want you to know, and again, I'm going to use this one which I've called clean data, but at this point it actually hasn't been cleaned up. I've just highlighted some things which we will focus in on. So the first thing here was to decide on the numbering and the coding as a group. This is not a problem when you're dealing with an electronic survey. So if you use something like SurveyMonkey or Google Forms, then you would get a spreadsheet version of that data, and it's not a problem. You're okay. You can actually start cleaning up the data from that particular point. But let's say you've got a paper copy of the survey, and so we want to collect maybe 200 of surveys from respondents here. And so we're going to print off 200. Actually, we'll probably print off more because there's going to be some that are damaged or so on. And so we're going to divide them up, and so that each person has anywhere from 35 to 50 of these surveys. And then we're going to send people out to collect the data. And hopefully it's at a time when we don't have COVID restrictions. But we've got paper copies and we've got respondents filling them out. When everybody has collected their data, what we need to do is to gather back together as a group and then sit down and actually manually number the surveys. So in one of the corners of the first page, of course, you would just put down the survey number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on like this. And let's say Fred has numbers 1 to 35. When we come to, say, Mary is not going to also number then her surveys 1 to 35. She's going to start at 36 up to 70, and so on, so that every single survey is uniquely numbered. And of course, you've probably recorded somewhere on a list here that Fred has numbers 1 to 35 and Mary has 35 to 70, and so on like that. That's really important because when you input data into a spreadsheet, you will make mistakes, and you'll go back later and say, what is this number about? And you can look and say, oh, that came from survey number 7. And so we just go and pull up survey number 7 and see what is it that person actually wrote. So that's a really important thing to do there. The other thing to note is to figure out your coding conventions. How you're actually going to input the data in your spreadsheet. So let me give you an example of this. What I've got here is I've got the gender column right there, okay? And just a real simple one like that can cause problems because you'll have some people that put them in as F and M. And if you have maybe, others or something like that, you could put down an O. And then there'll be other people that type it in as the full word, male, female. And then some will do capital F female, right? And then others would be small F female. And really it doesn't make a difference in terms of case, but it sure looks a lot neater when you are all doing it the same way. So that's a really important thing to note in terms of coding. When you take a look at a question like income, and I actually got an example here of income down here. So what is your annual gross pre-tax personal income? And so you want to figure out, well, how do you actually input these particular values? So if somebody checks off on a particular survey 30,000 to less than 40,000, how do you type that out? Do you use the dollar signs? Do you type it out exactly as it appears like that? Some people would put in just the midpoint, so they would put in a 35. And what I'd suggest in this case is that you don't do that, because you can always recode them later, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on that. Okay, but it's important that you figure out what convention that you use here. Now, this particular question here came from was actually added to the original Business Admin 111 personal data survey. It comes from the questionnaire on page D24 of your data collection unit. And this is, you can see at the top here, this is an example of a bad questionnaire. This is one that we want to tear apart and make each of the questions better. And so I've got the original 10 questions, and then I added a few down here just because they're very unique kind of questions. Things like check one only, check all that apply, ranking questions, open-ended questions at the bottom here, and so on. So I'll refer to those a little bit later. But here's the original data. So those first 10 columns here then were the data that I actually collected when I asked, I think it was over 80 students from a Business Admin 111 class to fill the thing out. And I put in the numbers just as I got them. And you can see that there's lots of different errors here. So just as an aside here, we're not talking about the questionnaire design. We'll talk about that in class here, but it's really important that your questions are designed correctly and so on, like that. So just getting back here then to what we were talking about, even if you have a well-designed question asking about a person's gender, for instance, you'll have different people that will put it in as either M or male, or small letters male, and so on like this. And so you want to be consistent in terms of that. All right, what else do we have here in terms of that part? Rating scales is really important too. I actually don't have a good example of a rating scale. I've got a rating scale right here, but it actually in the question says to use the numbers 1 to 10. But what if you have a typical Likert scale question? So we've got something like, rate the cleanliness of the bathrooms in our restaurant. And then they give you options: very unclean, unclean, neutral, clean, very clean. what you need to decide then as a group here is, are you going to actually put in the words themselves, very, very unclean, unclean, and so on like that, or are you going to number them? And so you need to decide that as a group. If you decide to number them, typically what you would do is you would choose the very unclean, so the most negative one, as a 1, up to very clean as a 5. And it may sound obvious to you, but some people will actually do it the other way around. When it comes to ranking questions, on the other hand, where you're asking people to rank their top 3 choices, then you will give the top choice then a 1, and the second choice a 2, and the third choice a 3, and so on like that. When it comes to the analysis, then you just need to know that when we're talking about rating scales, that a high number means that it's rated more favorably, and with ranking scales, actually a low number means that it is a higher or a better choice for them, their first choice, their second choice, their third choice. So again, spend time figuring out how you're going to actually code the actual questions. It's important when you take a look at a questionnaire here that you number the questions. And so what we've got here is we've got the numbers 1 to 10, but if this were a survey that came from, say, Google Forms or SurveyMonkey, there might not actually even be a question number. So you print off a hard copy, you go and everybody writes down question 1, question 2, question 3 against each one. And that's particularly important when you get into things like branching questions. So down here, and we'll talk more about branching questions later, we've got question 13, and then you actually answer this either yes or no. But if you answer it yes, then you would come down here and answer this particular question here. So this is kind of 2 questions in one here. And so you might have this as question 13.1, and then this is 13.2 as to how they answered right here. And we'll take a look at how that's done there. So it's important to go through and number your questions as well, especially if your original survey doesn't show numbers there. Okay, let's get back here. And so we're talking about deciding on the numbers and the coding as a group. Let's take a look now at the setup of the columns and the rows and things like that. So the thing to remember is, and you have been working on data sets in your first stats course, so you probably all know this, but every single column then represents a particular question on a questionnaire, or in stats, of course, we'll call that a variable. So that's everybody's gender down in one particular column here. A word here about just labeling at the very top here. And what you'll notice here is, for most of these, what I've done is I've actually labeled them with the question number, as well as just a few letters that would indicate what the variable is about. So I've got here, question 3 is height, question 4 is weight, and so on. So having the question number is really useful, as well as having just a bit of an explanation there. All right. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just clean this one up here and say that this is question 2 on gender. This is question 1 on the section. I do have something here called row. I'm going to actually change that to respondent number. Because that's what it actually represents here, is the respondent number. Where's my number sign? There it is. And then I'm just going to change the heights or the widths of these a little bit here. There we go. Good. So now each one I've got respondent number, then question 1, section, question 2, gender, and so on like that all the way along. Over here, Actually, we'll talk about these specific ones later. So let's leave that at this particular point. So the important thing to note is that every column then is for a particular variable. Every row is for a specific respondent. So all of the values or answers in a particular row is for respondent number 5 in this particular case. And it's really important that they stay together if you do any sorting. And we'll talk about sorting a little bit later when we get into cleaning the data. So we'll put that aside just for a moment here then. It's important that the columns here are contiguous. Contiguous means that they are all together here. In other words, you don't have a completely blank column like this. And what you'll see is I can go right down to 100, about 1 million cells here, and so like this, and all the way up. The reason for that is that if I go to, say, sort by gender, it will only sort up to column F in this particular case. It will actually consider H onwards to be a separate data set. So don't have a completely blank column. If you do add a column, then put in a label at the very top. Okay, so I'm going to put in, I'll just put in that it's some question. You would want to put in something which is more descriptive here, and we'll see an example of that later. And so that actually brings it back together. It's still considered a contiguous column because you've got a label at the very top there. I'm going to just get rid of that there. It's also important that your rows are contiguous. So by the same reasoning here then, if I had this kind of thing here, so column 15 then goes all the way to the end here, XFD, that's a lot of columns. Then if I go to sort these data or analyze them in some sort of way by using a pivot table or something, which we'll also talk about, Excel won't recognize that this is one data set. It will think that it's 2 data sets. So we don't want to have any break here. All right, let me take a look at my notes here. What you will notice is that there might be somebody who actually doesn't answer one or more questions. It might even be a whole set of questions. So if we take a look at some of these, you'll see that there might be some people here that don't answer particular questions. For instance, up here, we've got that this person didn't answer these questions right here. And so when you go to analyze those, it can be a problem if you make a copy of this data set and then you decide, oh, I'm only going to focus in on question 15. So you get rid of all the other columns, and what happens is that you'll end up with a blank row. Let me just do that as an example here. So if later when I'm doing my analysis, I'm going to take my clean data, let's say this is now in a cleaned form here, I'm going to make a copy and work only on this copy for question number 15. And so I might come up here and say, well, I don't need that particular column there, and I don't need all of this stuff right here. So I'm going to get rid of that. What you'll notice is that I kept the respondent column, the respondent number column. And the reason is that everybody has a respondent number. And so this is still considered to be a data set with contiguous rows. I can go and sort and do all sorts of things with this. Without that respondent column, I would actually have some blank rows here if I'm only focusing in on question 15 and I got rid of all the other columns. So that's why you want to have a respondent column. and because everybody has a respondent number, and that number corresponds to their survey number. So this would be, of course, question or survey number 7, respondent number 7. All right, I'm going to get rid of that particular page there. Let's delete that. And I'm going to go back to this guy right here. And so we've talked about contiguous columns, contiguous rows. We've got a respondent number, and they correspond to the number in each survey. And so this is a well set up set of columns and rows here. But there's a couple of more things that I'm going to do that will really help. What I like to do is to go down here to cell B2 and then go to View and freeze the panes right there. And now I'm using a Mac. It might be a little bit different in terms of the Excel version, but you will find the freeze panes there. Why this is useful is that if I'm doing a bunch of analysis down here, then what you'll notice down here is that the top column actually, this top row, pardon me, of the titles stays there. And so no matter where I am on the spreadsheet, I can always see those question labels. Similarly with respondent number, I like to freeze that one too, because you might be working way over here and you might have dozens and dozens of columns here. And this just helps you to recognize, oh yeah, I'm dealing with respondent number 63. And this is particularly useful when you get down to, say, something like this. You'll notice that this particular person didn't answer. These particular people did not answer the last few, some of the questions. So question 12 and question 13. And if I'm just focusing in on those guys right there, I can think that my data set actually ends right there. And it might just for the analysis of these questions, but the whole data set actually goes right down to row 83 in this case, respondent number 82. So that's why I like to have the respondents also frozen so that I can see the whole data set. All right. So that is that. There's a couple more things I want to show you, and that is what I like to do is I like to take one row. Let's take row 8 here. That's because it doesn't have any errors or anything else that I need to fix here on that. And I'm going to color it. So I'm going to color it here. Let's color it maybe a nice dark green or something. Oh, that's a little too dark. Let's color it orange. There we go. Now, that's really useful because when I go to do things like sorts, I'm going to talk about sorting later, but let me just give you an example of this. So I'm going to go to data sort, and I'm sorting according to height. And what you'll see then is that height is now in descending order, but all the other columns sorted with it. So I can go down here and just do a real quick check all the way along and say, did all the columns sort together? And yeah, they did. And I can tell that really quickly because my shaded row here has everything staying together here. So I'm going to go back up here. I sorted by respondent, and you can see that everything stays together. Okay, last thing that really helps in terms of working with your data here. Because eventually what you're going to do, of course, is to make copies of this data, and you're going to work on the copy sheet for a particular kind of problem. It's important with a data set that you have a completely blank column that separates the data set from anything to the right. So you can do a bunch of calculations and things to the right of the data set, but you don't want to be right beside it. And that's because if you go to sort, it'll get confused. It'll think that it's part of the data set and so on, so it can really get confusing. What you might want to do actually even is to give a color here then to those particular cells right beside it. So that tells you, don't go into the blue. Similarly, the row right underneath the data set here is something that should not have anything in it. So color it blue. So if you were doing things like, say, calculating the average for a particular column, you wouldn't put anything in that blue column here, or that blue row. You'd actually start below that, and then you could actually put in a function here to calculate, say, heights or weights or things like that. So this blue here then completely sets off the data set from anything else that is beside it. Let me just go and I'm just going to change this. And so you can see here that what we've got now is a nice block here. It's contiguous columns, contiguous rows. You've got a label for each column, which is its variable name and question name, question number. And then you've got a completely blank column and row on the right and the left. And if you had anything above, of course, you'd want a completely blank row above, and also to the left and to the right. Okay, so that's what the thing looks like. The advantage of that now is that if I make a copy of this to do my analysis, of course, I'm going to make a copy of the clean data. And then I can get rid of whatever columns I want. I can do all sorts of analysis, put in functions and so on, but they would all be outside of that blue area there. All right, the last thing that I want to talk about here, let me just increase the zoom there, is I want to go back to this questionnaire that I had here. And the original questions, which again came from page D24 here, are all check one only examples, or you're only going to give them one answer in each case. So what section of BizAdmin 111 are you in? And you're either going to put down A or B or E, something like that. Again, we're not talking about how to make these good questions at this point. That's something that we'll do at another time. But what we've got in the data set here then is that for all the check one only questions, you only have one column for each one. So they're really easy to set up. But I wanted to introduce some other kinds of questions down here. There's basically 4 types of questions that we have here. And so one of them then, and the main type that we're dealing with here, is a check one only question, which is what those first 10 were. Actually, that's also what we've got for the next 2 down here. And I've included these because I want to talk about some possible errors or how you would code these particular ones. Down here, though, we've got a branching question. So this is kind of like it's a check one only, but then it branches to a sub question. And so it's really 2 questions in one here. The other thing I've got down here is I've got an other category. Let's actually read through this. Do you ever sit at the tables at the RDC library? And if so, what is the main reason for using the tables? So the first thing that they would do is they would check off no or yes. And then what we do is if they put down yes, I then repeat the question. And I say, what's your main reason? Check one only and embolden that. And so they should then go and check one of these. Now, there might be some reason other than, say, a quiet break or studying by myself or studying with somebody else. There might be some other reason why they're there. Maybe it's because the tables are the best place to look for somebody walking across the field from the parking lot or something if you're going to meet somebody. So that might be the reason. And in that particular case, then, they would check off other, and then you would ask them here to elaborate. So just put down a few words like that. So let's take a look at how you actually set that up then in the data set. So what I've got down here is question 13, which is a no-yes thing. And so it's all yeses and nos. It might be better actually to put down something like this is the library, or it's seating, no or yes. So that's a little more descriptive like that. And we should only have no's and yeses here. And then what I've got is for question 13, if they answered yes, what is the reason? And so if you answered yes, there should be something which is put in here. You'll see that I've got an error here. We're going to talk about the error later. And then I've got that if they have other as the reason, then they may have a comment here in terms of what that other is. Hopefully they have elaborated on that. So what I've done here then is, this was a branching question, but I've actually got 3 columns that go together with this. What I typically do, it's not crucial that you do this, but what I usually do is I actually color these all the same. So I shade them all the same because I know that they go together. All right, let's take a look at 3 other types of questions. Number 14 says, which of the following services or facilities have you used at RDC in the last month? Check all that apply. Whenever you have a check all that apply question, you need to set up a column for each of the different categories. So that's what I've done here in number 14, right here. So if they checked off food, if they checked off Far Side, Document Center, sporting facilities, then you've got a separate column for each one. And then if they check it, you just simply put in a 1. If they don't, you leave it blank. Now, you can also have others, in which case you'd have an other, and then you would have a comment then next to it, just like you've got over here. All right? So you can do that with those as well. And then we've got ranking questions. So number 15 says, what are the 3 reasons for selecting RDC for your diploma? Rank up to 3 choices, where 1 is your top reason, and 2 is your second most important reason, and 3 is your third most important reason. Only rank those that are important reasons for you. Do not rank beyond 3 reasons. So they can rank less than 3, but they can't rank more than 3. The way that we set up the columns there is the same sort of way that we did for the check all that apply. In other words, that there is a column for each of the different categories. And then I've got an other here, and then an other comment like that. We'll talk a little bit about how to handle those a little bit later. Okay. What you do in this particular case here is when you enter in the numbers, you put them in as 1, 2, and 3. And we'll talk about some possible errors. You can see this, that some people actually put them in this way, and you want to be consistent in terms of how you do that. So we'll talk about that. And finally then, the last type of question that you've got here then is just an open-ended question. What do you like best about being an RDC student? Just a suggestion on that is it's probably good to just put in here one line, maybe 2 lines. I probably wouldn't go 3 lines or more, because some people will put in a whole paragraph. If you want them to put in a whole paragraph or several paragraphs, you can say something like, use the back of the sheet if you want to expand more on your answer. But by putting in just one line or two lines like this, you tend to keep the answers fairly short. And so what I've got over here then is it's like a check one only in that there's only one column, but what you're doing is you're just typing in the answer here. And we'll talk about some of the errors, or not really the errors, but the issues around how you handle that particular one. You can see right here, this is not a very long comment, and yet it just goes on and on and on in terms of the number of columns that it laps over. All right, so that is that. I think that's about where I'm going to end here for this. The next thing that you want to do here is to talk about how you actually clean up the data. So we're going to get into that a little bit later. But at this point then, we've talked about the setup of the data. And I guess I should have gone to this slide here. We talked about the question types. Again, there is 4 types. There's a check one only, which may also include branches. And then we've got a check all that apply, ranked questions, and open-ended questions. So I'm going to end the video at this particular point here, and then we're going to pick up the next important part, which is about cleaning up the data. So let's stop it here.